There was such controversy.
Why though? Mature doesn't mean necessarily. This doesn't help. I'm gonna look. I'm gonna look.
I
this
think
up
it's
very
because
quick.
it's Batman. Because if you, I think we mentioned
That doesn't mean anything.
No, because it's like a children's character essentially.
So, on March 8th, 2018, DC announced a new slate of standalone comics under a publishing imprint called Black Label. As explained in the press release, Black Label would deliver edgy and provocative standalone stories to the legends of Batman, Superman, and Wonder Woman. In other words, Black Label comic books would push the boundaries that normal DC comics couldn't. They were explicitly intended for adult audiences. On paper, that doesn't sound like a bad idea. In practice, Black Label created a publicity nightmare for DC. In the very first issue of the very first published Black Label series, Batman Damned, Book 1, readers saw for the first time ever Batman's penis depicted in official DC media. Jim Lee, chief creative officer of DC Comics, chalked the visible member up to a production error. He claimed that the color lightness was brought up in the comic to keep things from being too murky, incidentally leading to visible genitalia. The error explanation is reaffirmed by the fact that the digital comic wasn't brightened up, only the printed version. Although, as an aside, I question why the object of our discussion was drawn at all if it was always meant to be censored. The explanation didn't stop the oncoming ridicule, and whether because of or in spite of the controversy, Batman Damned sold out all 110,000 copies of what would later be called the Dong Edition. Subsequent copies were censored. When I say the mockery was widespread, I mean it. Even the likes of Seth Meyers and Stephen Colbert got in on the joke.
A new Batman comic shows the Caped Crusader's penis for the first time, so the new dynamic duo is Batman and Throbbin.
Of course, all that attention became a double-edged sword. Batman Damned, Book 1, did sell out, and reportedly Book 2 reorder sales outnumbered those on Book 1. However, the controversy hurt DC's reputation and led to a lot of internal turmoil at the company. Moreover, the entire controversy caused DC to rethink the Black Label on the whole, which is funny, right? Because the whole point of the Black Label was to produce comics for an adult audience. But then the comic was apparently too mature, and suddenly producing mature comics was a bad idea? The irony was not lost on critics. Vox writer Alex Abad-Santos wrote at the time, DC's dismissal of the image as not additive to the story feels a little disingenuous in the context of Black Label's stated mission. It's hard to imagine a scenario outside of a sex scene where nudity would be additive to a story. However, it would be additive to the mature reputation aimed specifically at adult readers. It also brings to mind some of the egregiously risque female costumes in mainstream comics that don't seem additive to the story behind providing titillating thrills. The series illustrator Lee Bermejo called the ordeal the biggest non-controversy in comics history. So, admittedly, I've sort of been paraphrasing a lot from Wikipedia here, but don't worry, I double-checked all the sources for myself. Still, now that the facts are out of the way, let me do some editorializing here. Now, I read the censored version of the scene, so I don't exactly know what Batman is working with, but I will say, I think the censored version was just as effective as the uncensored version would have been. See, in this scene, Bruce is returning to the Batcave after a night out doing vigilantism. He strips down to assess his injuries from the night. As he walks through the Batcave, he's suddenly startled by one of his stationary suits, which he hallucinates as coming to life and reaching out for him. In response, he crouches in a fetal position on the ground in front of the suit. As far as interpretation goes, I'd argue the nudity in the scene is meant to represent a couple of things. For one, Bruce's nakedness just emphasizes his vulnerability. Nudity in literature has long been a representation of vulnerability, arguably going all the way back to Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. For me, an even more interesting interpretation is one related to humanity. In a way, nakedness is the ultimate expression of one's humanity. We come into this world naked, after all. Brian Yoder from the Art Renewal Center would argue that this is the reason why nudity is so prevalent in art. In his words, the human body can be a beautiful thing to contemplate, and this can be a useful artistic tool in and of itself, just as flowers, sunsets, and mountains are similarly useful tools in the artist's toolkit. And if the point of art is primarily to express ideas about the nature of humanity, man's role in the world, then it would be natural to expect that the unadorned human form would be among the most powerful of those expressive tools, and indeed it is. As such, when Bruce's naked form becomes paralyzed at his batsuit, a reader recognizes that there is no humanity in the Batman persona, at least according to Bruce's subconscious. But let me re-emphasize, all of that meaning still comes across without having to see Bruce's nightstick. It's almost kind of amusing that the controversy around Batman Damned became more interesting than the book itself. I'd be curious to know the number of people who remember the story of the book versus the number of people who remember the penis of it all. It kind of calls into question whether making adult versions of children's content is a good idea in the first place. And before anyone says it, I know that comic books are not exclusively for kids, but when you consider merchandising and look at demographics that companies stand to gain the most from when deciding which demographics to market to, in a way, comics are primarily for younger readers, and that's another reason that the Batman nudity caused such a stir. Batman is, ostensibly, a children's character, which isn't to say the Black Label was a bad idea, but I remember when some of my favorite podcasters, James and Meso from The Weekly Planet, looked back at the controversy in 2020 on their podcast and YouTube channel. I remember on that YouTube video, one of the more popular comments read, "They should make a Black Label Scooby-Doo." 3 years later, we got Velma. And look, I won't rag too hard on Velma, not because I think it's undeserving of ragging, it's just that so many other people have already dug into it, I don't know how much more I can add to the conversation, frankly. I watched the first season in its entirety, and don't worry, I wasn't one of those people who hate-watched on Max and springboarded it into its second season. Let's just say, I watched it in a way that would not support Max directly. But the thing about Velma is that people don't hate it just for being an adult take on the Scooby-Doo franchise. People dislike it for being unfunny and warping the source material so far beyond what it originally was. And with that in mind, I do want to address just one quote from Velma. You might have seen this one floating around online.
Dear HBO Max, I just learned you intend to make a genre-bending comedic origin story of Judy Jetson. When I heard this new version of Judy Jetson wouldn't be boy crazy, the only word I had to describe my disgust is jinkies. If there is one thing the internet agrees on, it's that you should never change anything ever. I hope you die. Sincerely, Velma. Well.
Oh, yeah, that's another reason people don't like Velma, because the show talks down to its potential audience. I will admit there are a lot of people out there who dislike change for no good reason, but boiling all the criticism against Velma down to people don't like change is obtuse. People love change when it's good. Maybe not all the time, but I can think of a few examples off the top of my head. Cobra Kai is a show all about change. The show recontextualizes and in some cases reimagines elements from the original Karate Kid franchise. At its heart, the show is all about whether people really can change. I've seen nothing but praise for Cobra Kai. Andor feels very different from all other Star Wars properties and people love it. Into the Spider-Verse was a huge swing for Sony and it was a home run. Or as far as reboots go, we can look at the 2010s Planet of the Apes or Mad Max interpretations. And again, I re-emphasize that some people are just change-averse. They cannot accept things that are different. But no, change on its own is not the thing people hate about Velma. A lot of people have pointed this out before, but the show probably would have fared a lot better if it were an original property rather than another Scooby-Doo reboot. Granted, the live-action Scooby-Doo films had their share of adult undertones, and people have mixed feelings about those. But let me just say, I will defend the second movie. It rocks and is an all-around great homage to the franchise. To shift gears a little bit, the other day I was scrolling through Instagram and I came across this. It's a fan-made WordGirl comic, a parody/homage to Invincible called Final Definition. For the uninitiated, WordGirl was an old cartoon on PBS whose titular character fought crime and taught vocabulary. And, as you might imagine, as a lover of superheroes and language arts, I ate that up. Back when Invincible hit Amazon, people drew comparisons between Season 1's final fight and an important fight from WordGirl. It would seem that the artist behind this comic, 80 miles per hour, was inspired by the memes comparing the two shows. And with the popularity of this comparison, they aren't the only ones to draw these kinds of similarities or indulge in this sort of fan art. As much as I like seeing these comparisons, I often see a similar sentiment repeated in response. For example, this comment on 80 miles per hour's comic, "I need a WordGirl not for kids reboot now." And I understand the sentiment, especially when seeing how good these comic panels are, but based on the track record of not for kids reboots, is that something we really want? Do we truly want to risk that? It might be worth asking why these adult reboots keep happening. Of course, I'm sure we all know the answer. It's capitalism, it's pure economics. Nostalgia is a commodity, so when kids get older, corporations think they can sell the same things they bought as kids. And sometimes they're right. That's basically been Disney's entire strategy for the last, I don't even know how long, but especially as of late, Disney has been pouring all their resources into sequels and remakes. This isn't exactly a one-to-one since it's not really an adult reboot, but consider Monsters, Inc. The first movie came out in 2001. Then in 2013, Pixar released Monsters University at around the same time when Monsters, Inc. fans would have been in college. Then in 2021, Disney Plus came out with Monsters at Work, when original Monsters, Inc. fans would theoretically have a steady job. Or consider the weird remakes of classic Disney properties that Disney is still churning out. These aren't necessarily mature movies, but the target audience is definitely adults. I'm not the first one to point this out, but kids don't really enjoy these. This is anecdotal, but I remember during the pandemic when we rented the live-action Mulan from Disney+. All of my nieces and nephews tapped out after like 20 minutes. These gritty remakes are squarely for the adults who enjoyed the originals. That's what makes them so baffling. It's like, how would you enjoy these movies unless you were a fan of the originals? But if you're a fan of the originals, you would theoretically hate the downgrade that is these live-action remakes. Although, to play devil's advocate, I know people like some of these movies. Heck, I'll say it, I really liked Cruella. Yeah, I know on paper the idea of Dalmatians killing Cruella de Vil's mom sounds ridiculous, but that's not really what the movie is about. In fact, this movie isn't really about the Cruella de Vil we know at all. It would be so easy to remove the references to 101 Dalmatians, and if you did, it would still be a pretty good movie. I'll die on that hill. I did not expect so many hot takes to come up in this video. Digression aside, Disney knows that the remake model is not sustainable. Even if The Little Mermaid hadn't underperformed, there are only so many movies that Disney can remake. That's why they're now expanding their remake universe with the upcoming Mufasa, a movie that none of us are going to see. Right, guys? Right? Right? Funnily enough, the more profitable move would be to invest more in original projects, seeing as Disney's desire to wrap everything in an existing property is continually backfiring. Moreover, Disney's push to create content geared toward their pre-existing audience impedes them from creating a new audience. This brings up an important point. Just because media is directed at kids doesn't mean adults can't or shouldn't enjoy it. Does Disney think they won't net their nostalgic audience if they let their creatives come up with new ideas? Properties like WordGirl and Scooby-Doo are actually quite charming for their ability to entertain kids and adults alike. The wide appeal is what keeps them alive in our minds today. In fact, Scooby-Doo Mystery Incorporated is a show that was directed at children, but might honestly click more with an older audience, given the sometimes dark subject matter and somewhat complex overarching storylines. But, of course, we can't talk about adult reboots without mentioning it. The bane of those who love comic books and children's programming, the CW. I'm sure everyone is familiar with Riverdale at this point. Riverdale took on such a life of its own among millennials and Gen Z that it's sometimes easy to forget this is technically an adaptation. The show started with some similarities to the Archie comics canon on which it was based. Most of these similarities were in name only, much like Cruella. However, as the show went on, it just felt all the more divorced from its source material. Riverdale hung on to its inspiration by a thread. Riverdale went on to inspire the Archieverse, a TV universe comprised of Riverdale, The Chilling Adventures of Sabrina, and Katie Keene. Admittedly, I don't know much about the latter two shows, but based on their short runs, I can't imagine fans of the original series were happy to indulge in each new episode. And we can't talk about the CW without mentioning this. A lot of you have probably forgotten about this by now. I know I did before I started making this video. But these are set photos from the CW's attempt to do a live-action sequel/reboot of the Powerpuff Girls. From the project's announcement, it was immediately met with scrutiny. Matters weren't helped when the script allegedly leaked online. Reports dispute how authentic these leaks were, but shortly after the news spread online, the CW announced it would be reworking the project, and that feels a little too coincidental if the leaks were fake. Eventually, the project was just cancelled outright, which is kind of a shame considering how excited the cast was. Admittedly, I'm guilty of hoping projects fail from time to time, which is a bad trait on my part. I should hope more for competency among creatives. Like, when Wonka came out, I expected it would be yet another cynical cash grab banking on IP. And yes, maybe a fraction of it was indeed just that, but people ended up really enjoying it. Or see again the previously mentioned Andor. Again, I feared this would just be a vapid show trying to bank on IP like some of the other Star Wars Disney Plus projects. Instead, I was blown away by an anti-fascist art piece. So yeah, Powerpuff, much like many other CW projects that actually did get off the ground, was just embarrassing. But it didn't have to be. There's a universe where a live-action, adult-oriented Powerpuff Girls could have worked. I fear that I made it sound like adult reboots can never work, and that's simply not the case. What makes or breaks an adult reboot is its focus. That probably sounds like an obvious thing to say, and yet so many of these mature reimaginings just lose themselves entirely. We'll take Scooby-Doo as our example. If you had the opportunity to create a mature reimagining of Scooby-Doo, which adult elements would you choose to implement? Probably the mystery element, right? Make the crimes a little more weighted in dangerous stakes, or the supernatural elements. When I watched Velma's first season, its most compelling feature was the mystery, but they kind of fumbled the bag on that at the end. Another point of praise for several viewers was the animation, particularly during Velma's hallucination sequences. The wild, wacky, supernatural bits were engaging. So, with Velma given the flexibility to incorporate mature elements, they should have focused more on the mystery and on the supernatural. Great. So, why then does Velma open with a shower scene in a girl's locker room? Why is nudity even something we're considering when the show takes place in a high school? It's no secret that Gen Z viewers are becoming real soured on sex scenes in media. That was one of the biggest complaints I saw around Oppenheimer, the nudity that many viewers found unnecessary. But to say that Gen Z hates all sex scenes on principle wouldn't exactly be true. From what I understand, Poor Things and Saltburn did well even with younger audiences, though admittedly I haven't seen either. Then more recently there was Challengers, a movie that NPR's Pop Culture Happy Hour described as horny, but not porny. So why do the sex scenes and nudity in these movies work but fall flat in projects like Velma or Riverdale? Well, it's probably worth noting why sex scenes usually don't work. In Thomas C. Foster's How to Read Literature Like a Professor, he has 2 chapters dedicated to sex in writing. To open page 151, Foster jokingly challenges the reader to go write a sex scene. He then explains, "When you come back in a day, in a week, in a month, you'll have found out what most writers already know. Describing 2 human beings engaging in the most intimate of shared acts is very nearly the least rewarding enterprise a writer can undertake. Don't feel bad, you never had a chance. What are your options? The possible circumstances that lead 2 people to sexual congress are virtually limitless. But the act itself? How many options do you have?" He also adds, "Frankly, there just isn't that much variety with or without the ready whip, and besides, it's been written in the mass of pornography ad nauseum." See, most people don't engage with media for sex scenes. As Foster points out, there are plenty of other resources people have to engage exclusively with sex. But that's not to say sex scenes don't have any place in literature. As Foster later writes, "You just know that these scenes mean something more than what's going on in them. It's true in life as well, where sex can be pleasure, sacrifice, submission, rebellion, resignation, supplication, dominance, enlightenment, the whole works. Sometimes even good literary sex is about something else." Indeed, as with any moving piece in a story, a sex scene ought to move things along in one way or another. It should reveal something about the world, the plot, or most likely the characters. As such, the more interesting sex scenes are those which aren't really sex scenes at all. Foster brings up Ann Beattie's short story Janus, saying, "Even in our highly permissive age though, sex often doesn't appear in its own guise. It is displaced into other areas of experience in much the same way it is in our own lives and our own consciousnesses." Ann Beattie's character Andrea doesn't think of her problems as being chiefly sexual or romantic, but they are, as we and her creator can see. So it's unlikely that her sexual issues will present themselves in terms of sexual organs and acts. Much more likely they'll look like a bowl and some keys. So for example, the tennis scenes in Challengers aren't just about tennis. Do you catch my drift? The scenes in Challengers are still focused on the project of the movie at large. Meanwhile, the spicy scenes in Riverdale just feel like weird fantasy fulfillment on the part of Roberto Aguirre Sacasa. Moreover, Velma tries to lampshade its nudity, but merely pointing it out doesn't make it less egregious, it's still there. We can say the same for violence. Violence without purpose is just as frustrating as sex scenes without purpose. For a good example, I think of Invincible. The violence in this show serves both the narrative about power and the larger deconstruction of typical superhero narratives. For a bad example, I think of Zack Snyder's Batman v Superman, where Batman violently kills others for really no reason other than mindless action. My mind also turns to Samurai Jack, a show that couldn't feature violence in its initial seasons since it was meant for kids. How did the animators get around that? Easy. Jack would just slice up some robots. It didn't feel gratuitous, it felt well choreographed, and each new challenge added to Jack's journey through time and as a person. When the show was revived in 2017, Adult Swim picked it up for a limited run. As such, the show took advantage of what a samurai sword could really do. But even this still felt purposeful. As Nick Statt wrote for The Verge back in 2017, the most telling transformations reside inside Jack's psyche. Over 50 years of fighting Aku, he has not aged a day. This is, he says, an unforeseen byproduct of his journey through time. He is haunted by his inability to protect his family in the past and reverse the course of history that brought Aku to ascendancy. Aku has also squashed every portal back in time, turning Jack into a Ronin, tortured by his failure and with no mission in mind. So once again, I have to re-emphasize, reimaginings targeted at adults aren't doomed to fail. There are so many good examples. We started this whole thing by talking about Batman. Batman Damned was received very well, even in spite of the controversy. The Dark Knight and 2022's The Batman both feel extremely adult-oriented, and they're great. However, and I mentioned this briefly, sometimes adult-oriented media is all the better when it's still suitable for kids. I asked my patrons on Discord if they had any good examples of remakes aimed at adults, and they answered with 2009's Where the Wild Things Are, Guillermo del Toro's Pinocchio, Detective Pikachu, and Pokémon Concierge. Notice that none of these projects are unsuitable for kids. The thing is, the messaging would probably resonate more with adults than it would with children. The only example mentioned that was unsuitable for children by rating standards was Lies of P, which is based on Pinocchio. And that's not to say it's the only example, but I think it's just very telling that the majority of examples that came to mind were projects suitable for all ages. For me, that just re-emphasizes that it's all about focus. Most successful adult reimaginings recognize that they don't need sex or violence to be successful. If anything, those elements might actually take away from what would otherwise make a premise great. But what do you think? Do you agree or disagree with my assertions? Which adult-oriented reboots do you think were successful? Which children's properties do you think deserve a more mature treatment? Please tell me everything, and hey, before you go, listen to this poem from one of my patrons. This poem is called Bees by Madison Rye Progress. Bees are those who give us sweet in exchange for the names of the dead. We whisper to their hives, then wait a season for honey, licking it from sticky fingers when we steal a taste. Is it any wonder then that honey can be so cloying? We may marvel at how unbitter distilled names can be, and still weep at parching sweet memory. For the chance to showcase your writing at the end of my videos, or if you just like what I do and want to support me, feel free to donate to my Patreon. You'll also receive access to the community Discord, early access to videos, and priority review over on the second channel. Subscribe over there if you want. I genuinely can't thank my patrons enough for their support. If you really want to support the channel in other important ways, liking, commenting, and subscribing really goes a long way. You can also follow me on Instagram to see what I'm reading, and Twitter for whatever else. Thanks for watching, and ultimately keep in mind this is a rough draft.